Every family has a joke that gets told so many times, nobody remembers why it's funny anymore. In one small house in Bristol, England, that joke was about the sun. Every summer, when the other children turned pink and burned, one little girl turned a deep golden brown, darker than her mother, darker than anyone else at the table. And every summer her mother would laugh and say the same 6 words, "You're not the milkmans, you're the sailors." It got a laugh every time. It got repeated at birthdays, at holidays, at family dinners for almost 40 years. Nobody ever asked what it meant. Nobody ever thought to ask. Because some jokes are told exactly so that nobody ever asks the real question underneath them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, back to Rachel, 46 years old, a mother herself now, a woman who had built an entire life around a version of her own story that she had never once questioned. That version was about to end. It was Black Friday. Everyone around her was buying air fryers and discount candles. Rachel bought something smaller and far more dangerous. A 27-pound DNA testing kit, tossed into her basket almost as an afterthought, more out of boredom than any real hunger for answers. She had no idea she was holding a question that had been waiting nearly 5 decades to be asked. She swabbed her cheek the way the instructions told her to, sealed the little tube, and dropped it into a mailbox without a second thought. It felt almost silly. A gimmick. Something to satisfy an idle curiosity about ancestry maps and pie charts of nationalities. She told herself she was doing it for fun. But somewhere underneath that casual decision was a much older feeling, one she had carried since childhood without ever giving it a name, the sense that she did not quite fit the shape of the family she had grown up in, that there was a piece of her story that had been quietly left out of every conversation. She sealed the envelope, walked it to the post office, and went back to her ordinary life. She had no idea the wait had already begun. For weeks, nothing happened. Life went on the way it always does, filled with small, ordinary things that make up a life. Work, errands, dinner with her children, and somewhere in a laboratory hundreds of miles away, a machine was quietly reading the oldest code she owned, the one written into every cell of her body before she ever took a breath. Rachel had almost forgotten about the test entirely when the email finally arrived. "Your DNA results are ready." 6 words. She stared at them for a long moment before she opened the link, some instinct telling her that once she clicked it, there would be no way to go back to not knowing. She clicked it anyway, and the version of her life she had always believed in began, quietly, to come apart. The page loaded slowly, the way technology always seems to slow down, at the exact moment your heart speeds up. A pie chart appeared first, ordinary enough, then a list of matches. Then, near the top, a name she did not recognize, flagged with a relationship so close it could not be a coincidence. Close family. Rachel read it twice. Then a third time, her mind reached instinctively for her father, the man who had raised her, taught her to ride a bike, walked her down the aisle. But the numbers on the screen did not match him. They did not match anyone she had ever known. Somewhere in that quiet room, lit only by a laptop screen, 46 years of an old family joke suddenly stopped being funny and started sounding like a confession nobody had ever meant to make out loud. Rachel did not wait until morning. She drove straight to her mother's house that same night, the printed DNA results folded in her coat pocket like evidence she was almost afraid to present. Linda opened the door already knowing, in the way that mothers always seem to know, that something had shifted. They sat down at the kitchen table where Rachel had eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners as a child, and for a long moment neither woman spoke. Then Rachel asked the question she had carried since she was 8 years old without ever saying it aloud. Was the joke ever really a joke? Linda's eyes filled with tears before she answered. And in that small, quiet kitchen, nearly 50 years of silence finally broke. The truth Linda told that night had been sealed away for decades. Before she married the man Rachel called Dad, there had been someone else, briefly, quietly, a young Royal Marine commando named Bobby Hayes, home on leave near the docks. It had lasted only a short while. He had shipped out again before she even knew she was carrying his child. Frightened, and unwilling to unravel the life she was building, Linda made a decision that millions of women of her generation were forced to make in silence. She said nothing. She married, she raised her daughter as her own family's child, and she buried the truth so deep that even she had almost convinced herself the joke about the sailor was only ever a joke. Now, decades later, A 27-pound test had undone it in a single afternoon. Armed with a name for the first time in her life, Rachel went looking for the man behind it. What she found overwhelmed her. Bobby Hayes was not a stranger who had vanished without a trace. He had lived a full life, built a family of his own, and along the way had fathered 7 other children Rachel had never known existed. 7 half-brothers and sisters scattered across different towns, different lives, all completely unaware that somewhere out there was another sibling who shared their blood. The family tree Rachel began to build that night stretched back further than she ever imagined, threading through records and names that eventually traced, astonishingly, all the way back to William the Conqueror himself. She sat in the dark, staring at a lineage 900 years deep, and felt, for the first time in her life, that she finally understood where she came from like. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from looking at the face of a parent you have never met and suddenly recognizing your own features staring back at you. Rachel found an old photograph of Bobby Hayes from his years of service, young, disciplined, dressed in the uniform of a man who had spent his life running toward danger rather than away from it. She studied his jawline, his eyes, the set of his shoulders, and saw pieces of herself she had never been able to explain before. For 46 years she had wondered why she never quite resembled the family she grew up beside. Now she understood. The resemblance had been waiting on the other side of an ocean of silence the whole time, patient, unclaimed, and entirely real. Learning a name was one thing, reaching out to the people attached to it was another entirely. Rachel spent nights composing and deleting messages to her newfound half-brothers and sisters, terrified of intruding on lives that had never asked to be disrupted by a stranger claiming shared blood. But curiosity, and something deeper than curiosity, a genuine ache to belong somewhere fully for the first time, eventually won out. One by one, she began sending careful, gentle messages, introducing herself, explaining the test, bracing herself for silence, rejection, or worse. What she received instead astonished her. Warmth, curiosity, welcome. Slowly, a family she never knew she had began opening its doors to her, one message at a time. But the biggest revelation of all was still, at that point, completely unknown to her, waiting quietly on the other side of the world. On the other side of the world, in a small coastal town called Cannonvale, Australia, a woman named Emily Carter had spent most of her adult life searching for something she could not quite name. She had been adopted as a baby, raised by loving parents who never hid the truth from her, but who also could not answer the one question that mattered most. Who was her birth mother? For years, Emily had chased that question through paperwork, agencies, and dead ends, each one closing a little more of the door she was trying to open. She had built a life, a family, a home by the water, and still, somewhere underneath all of it, there remained an unanswered space where an origin story should have been. By the time she reached her 50s, Emily had almost made peace with never knowing. Her subscription to the genealogy service she had used for years was set to expire in a matter of days, and she had already decided, quietly, that she would let it lapse. Enough was enough. She had spent decades chasing a ghost that never answered back, and some part of her simply wanted to stop hoping. I was at my wit's end and ready to give up, she would later admit. But before that subscription could quietly end, one final notification appeared on her screen. Small, easy to miss. The kind of message that looks entirely unremarkable until you realize it is about to change everything. A new match had been found. A first cousin. Emily clicked the notification with hands that were no longer entirely steady. A name appeared. Rachel Mitchell. A location an ocean away, in Bristol, England. A relationship close enough that it could not be dismissed as coincidence. For a woman who had spent years bracing herself for one more disappointment, this felt different. This felt real. She read the profile twice, then a third time, searching for any detail that might explain the connection, before finally, carefully, she began typing a message to a complete stranger who might, impossibly, be family. When I got that match, and then her message, I was completely blown away, she later said. Neither woman had any idea, in that first exchange, just how close their lives were about to become, or how much more waited beneath the surface of that single message. What began as a single cautious message quickly became something neither woman expected. Rachel replied within hours. Emily replied again before she had even finished processing the first response. Messages turned into phone calls. Phone calls turned into long conversations that stretched late into the night on one side of the world and early into the morning on the other. Two women separated by an entire ocean and a full day's time difference, speaking as though they had known each other their whole lives. They compared photographs, family stories, mannerisms, small details that seemed to click into place one after another. For the first time in her life, Emily was not chasing a ghost anymore. She was talking to a living, breathing piece of the family she had spent decades searching for. It was during one of those quiet, ordinary nights, long after the excitement of the first message had settled into something calmer, that Rachel noticed something that made her sit up straight. She was looking through the details Emily had shared, the birth date, the adoption paperwork, small fragments of a life that had begun in mystery. And something about those details felt strangely familiar, in a way Rachel could not immediately explain. A date, a place, a story she had heard once before, whispered quietly, and never fully discussed, from a completely different corner of her own family. She sat very still for a long moment, running the numbers again in her head, telling herself she had to be wrong, but some part of her already suspected she was not. Rachel spent that night the way she had once spent the nights right after her own results arrived, hunched over paperwork, chasing a feeling she could not quite shake. She pulled up every scrap of family history she could find, birth records, old letters, stories her mother had mentioned only once or twice in passing and never explained fully. Slowly, carefully, a pattern began to take shape, a date that matched almost exactly, a place that lined up with a story she had heard as a child about an aunt who had once, quietly, painfully, given up a baby many decades ago. Rachel sat back in her chair, heart pounding, staring at the paper in front of her. The woman she had been laughing and crying with on the phone for weeks might not be a distant cousin at all. She might be family in a much closer, much more heartbreaking way. To understand what Rachel had uncovered, it helps to go back more than 50 years, to a much younger version of a woman named Margaret. In an era when having a child outside of marriage carried a weight of shame that is difficult to imagine today, Margaret had given birth to a baby girl she was never given the chance to raise. She was made to give the child up, quietly, without ceremony, without the comfort of ever being allowed to say a proper goodbye. For more than 5 decades, Margaret carried that loss the way so many women of her generation were forced to, silently, privately, never speaking of it openly, wondering every single year on a certain date in a certain month, what had become of the daughter she had never been allowed to know. Rachel could not simply sit with what she had found. She needed to know for certain before she said a single word to anyone, and there was only one person who might be able to confirm it. She went back to her mother's house a second time, notebook in hand, and laid out everything she had pieced together, the dates, the records, the story of Auntie Margaret that had always existed at the edges of family conversation, but had never once been spoken about directly. Linda listened quietly, her face growing pale, and when Rachel finally finished, her mother nodded slowly. It was true. The story was real, and somewhere on the other side of the world, a woman named Emily Carter had spent her entire life searching for a mother who was still alive, still waiting, and had absolutely no idea her daughter had just been found. Telling a frail 80-year-old woman that the daughter she had grieved for more than half a century was not only alive, but had just spent weeks talking to her on the phone without either of them knowing, was not a conversation Rachel could rush into carelessly. She sat outside her aunt's house for nearly 10 minutes before she found the courage to go inside, rehearsing the words in her head, terrified of causing more pain than joy, terrified of getting it wrong. But some truths, once uncovered, cannot stay buried any longer. Rachel took a breath, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the front door, carrying with her news that was about to end 50 years of silent, unanswered grief in a single conversation. Rachel knelt beside her aunt's chair and told her everything, slowly, gently, watching her face the entire time for any sign of how the news was landing. She spoke of Emily, of Australia, of a first cousin match that had turned into something far more significant, of dates that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all. She simply stared at Rachel, absorbing decades of unanswered questions collapsing into a single afternoon. And then, finally, the tears came. Not tears of shock alone, but tears of a grief finally allowed to rest. The daughter she had never stopped thinking about, never stopped wondering over, was alive, was well, and was, unbelievably, only a phone call away. The phone call happened 2 days later, arranged carefully across a 13-hour time difference, timed so that neither woman would have to wait through the night wondering. Rachel dialed the number and placed the phone gently into her aunt's trembling hands. On the other end of the line, in a kitchen overlooking the Australian coast, Emily Carter picked up, her own hands shaking just as badly. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. 50 years of silence sat between them, waiting to be broken by nothing more than a simple hello. When Margaret finally found her voice, it cracked on the very first word, and on the other side of the world, Emily began to cry before her mother had even finished the sentence. Over the course of that first call, decades of unanswered questions finally found their answers. Margaret spoke of the daughter she had never been allowed to hold for more than a few brief moments. Emily spoke of a childhood spent wondering, of a subscription she had nearly let expire just days before everything changed. Neither woman tried to rush the conversation or fill every silence. They simply let each other speak, let each word land, let 50 years of distance begin, finally, to close. Margaret, who had carried that silent ache her whole life, later said only 3 words to describe how she felt in that moment. She was, in her own words, completely over the moon. Months of phone calls eventually built toward the moment both women had been waiting for their entire lives, a face-to-face meeting, in person, after more than 50 years apart. Emily flew halfway around the world, carrying with her a lifetime of questions and a suitcase far too small to hold everything she was feeling. Margaret, frail but determined, insisted on being there in person to meet her daughter at the airport rather than waiting at home. When Emily finally walked through those doors, and their eyes met for the first time, there was no need for introductions. The resemblance did the talking before either woman said a single word. A face so familiar, and only now finally found. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, saying nothing, because there was simply nothing that needed to be said. Rachel stood a few feet away, watching the moment she had helped uncover finally become real, tears slipping down her own face. She had started this journey searching for a father she had never known, a sailor mentioned once in an old family joke. She never imagined that search would also lead her to reunite an aunt and a cousin who had spent half a century separated by silence. 2 family secrets, buried decades apart, had somehow found each other through nothing more than a 27-pound test bought almost as an afterthought on a Black Friday sale. Looking back now, Rachel still finds it hard to believe how much unraveled from one small, almost forgettable decision. A discounted test bought out of boredom uncovered a biological father she never knew, 7 siblings she never expected, and reunited an aunt and a daughter separated for more than 50 years. She often thinks back to that old family joke, the one about the sailor, repeated so many times over so many years that nobody ever thought to question it. It turned out not to be a joke at all. It was the truth, waiting patiently, for nearly half a century, to finally be told. Sometimes the answers we spend our whole lives searching for are closer than we ever imagined, hidden in plain sight, inside the people who loved us all along. Before Emily allowed herself to fully celebrate what she had found, there was one conversation she knew she owed to someone else entirely, the woman who had raised her. She sat her adoptive mother down and told her everything, the DNA match, the biological mother in England, the cousin turned sister across the world. She had feared, in some quiet corner of her heart, that the news might sting, that finding one mother might feel like a betrayal of the other. It did not. Her adoptive mother listened, smiled, and told Emily she had always known this day might come, and that she had never once wished for anything but her daughter's full and complete happiness. It was, Emily would later say, one of the most important conversations of her entire life. In the weeks that followed, Rachel and Emily talked more than either of them had talked to almost anyone else in their lives. What began as cautious introductions became marathon phone calls that stretched on for hours, sometimes 6 hours at a time, neither woman willing to be the first to hang up. They compared childhoods lived an ocean apart, habits neither could explain until they heard the other describe the exact same one, small physical gestures that seemed to have crossed continents through blood alone. Rachel would later say they no longer felt like distant cousins meeting by chance. They felt, in every way that mattered, like sisters who had simply been separated by circumstance and geography for most of their lives, and were now finally making up for lost time. As the calls between Rachel and Emily continued, Margaret began, slowly, to tell the fuller story she had kept locked away for more than 50 years. She had been married once before, with 2 children of her own from that marriage, before the relationship ended and she met the man who would become Emily's father. When she became pregnant, he left her with nothing, no support, no plan, no way to raise a 3rd child on her own in a world that offered little mercy to a single mother in her position. Placing her daughter for adoption had been, she said, the most painful decision of her entire life, one she carried in silence for decades, never once expecting it might someday be undone. Rachel began sending Emily old photographs of Margaret from her younger years, carefully restored and colorized so the details would not be lost to time. When Emily opened the first image, she sat completely still for a long moment. The resemblance was almost impossible to process, a face so close to her own that it gave her, in her own words, goosebumps down her arms. For a woman who had spent her whole life wondering who she looked like, wondering whose eyes she had inherited, whose smile, whose expressions, the answer was suddenly staring back at her from a photograph taken decades before she was even born. It was not just an answer, it was proof, undeniable and immediate, of exactly where she came from. It was not long before phone calls alone stopped being enough for either of them. Rachel and Emily began planning a trip together, determined to stand in the same room as the family they had spent so long searching for and finding only through screens and phone lines. They talked about it the way people talk about trips they intend to actually take, checking flight prices, comparing calendars, promising each other it would happen soon rather than someday. For 2 women who had spent decades assuming this kind of closeness simply was not available to them, the ordinary logistics of planning a family visit felt like a quiet miracle in themselves. Mundane details wrapped around something that still, some days, felt too large to be entirely real. Not every story like this one ends in celebration, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Genealogy experts who have watched thousands of families navigate exactly this kind of discovery caution that these tests do not always bring people closer together. One respected editor in the field of family history research has warned publicly that DNA searches can, in her words, absolutely tear families apart. She has met people who deeply regretted ever sending in that small tube of saliva, people whose discoveries were met not with open arms but with anger, denial, or permanent silence. Her advice to anyone considering the same path Rachel took is simple and sobering. If the idea of taking the test already makes you nervous, trust that instinct and think carefully before you proceed. Rachel understands that warning better than most. She knows how easily her own story could have gone differently, how a different family might have responded to a stranger's message with silence instead of warmth, how a different aunt might have wanted the past to remain exactly where she had buried it. She has thought often about how fragile the whole outcome truly was, how many small decisions, a message sent, a message answered, a subscription almost allowed to expire, had to align perfectly for any of it to happen at all. She does not take the ending for granted. She sees it, instead, as something closer to luck, arriving at exactly the right moment, for exactly the right people, after exactly the right amount of waiting. Today, the story that began with an old joke about a sailor and a mother who never quite told the whole truth has become something none of them could have predicted. A father found, 7 siblings welcomed, an aunt and a daughter reunited after more than 50 years of silence, and 2 women, on opposite sides of the world, who now call each other sister rather than cousin. It started with a 27-pound test, bought almost by accident on a Black Friday sale, and it ended up rewriting the shape of an entire family tree, one branch at a time. Sometimes the biggest truths of our lives are hiding in the smallest, most forgettable decisions, waiting patiently for the right moment to finally come to light.